Hello, my name is Matt Slaughter. The topic of my paper is How News Media Influences Public Perception on Environmental Issues and Organizations. I came up with this idea after studying oceanography. I developed a hunch that the way in which news media report on environmental news and organizations might influence target audiences toward a state of learned helplessness in their ability to affect change in said issues. I believe this topic to be important because we ought to know the truth about the nature of the problems and threats our environment is facing and the potential long term outcomes of proposed strategies and practices towards sustainability. If environmental issues are reported on in a way that influences audiences to ignore the issues, we may end up living with unfortunate realities that could have easily been avoided. A researcher named Cecilia Tortajada published a study in May of 2016 titled Non-Governmental Organizations and Influence on Public Policy. The author does not pose any questions in this journal, but instead evaluates non-governmental organizations' level of influence in the past and present. This body of research tells us that news media has become increasingly critical of NGOs in recent years and has resulted in the sector's diminished credibility and reputation in the international community. And unless changes are made, this will result in the sector to lose all of its credibility and influence in the future. Two researchers named Barbara L. Lay and Paul R. Brewer published a journal in 2013 titled Whose Science Do You Believe? Explaining Trust and Sources of Scientific Information about the Environment. The journal asks questions that seek to understand how researchers can predict the public's trust based on each of the sources of interest, like attendance at religious services, trust in government, and trust in scientists. Their research tells us which sources of scientific information play roles in scientific controversies involving the environment. Two researchers named Anne M. Major and Irwin L. Atwood published a journal in 2004 titled Environmental Risks in the News: Issues, Sources, Problems, and Values. The journal asks questions about how environmental risks and issues are defined and what values are associated with these issues in news media. Their research tells us that news media report on environmental risks in a way that focuses on uncommon risks that are not necessarily newsworthy. This tells us that news media influences public perception in a way that distracts them from focusing on important environmental issues and organizations. A researcher named Linda Kaloff published a journal in 1997 titled Understanding the Social Construction of Concern. This journal poses research questions that seek to understand what influences the public's attitudes, perceptions, and subjective assessments of environmental issues and how the structures of these are perceived by the audience. The research tells us that news media influences public perceptions of the quality of environmental content, which may diminish their participation if they feel it is irrelevant. Two researchers named Etienne Sabatier and Charlie Webniers published a journal in 2018 titled Changes in Media Portrayal of Human-Wildlife Conflict During Successive Fatal Shark Bites. This journal does not pose any research questions, but instead poses the hypotheses and then analyzes previous studies and journals to draw conclusions to support their hypotheses. This research tells us that media framing in the topic of wildlife behavior can influence the public's perception on the environment and environmental organizations, which can lead to an increased public support and policy that encourages increased conservation measures in species that are perceived as dangerous based on the news media's framing. A researcher named Jarko Kangas published a journal in 2019 titled Picturing Two Modernities: Ecological Modernization and the Media Imagery of Climate Change. The study asks questions that seek to understand the effects of using symbolic images in environmental news reporting. The research tells us that the use of symbolic images by news media misrepresents and limits the discussion of climate change. This can prevent audiences from making informed decisions as voters on matters of public policy. The research tells us that news media use of symbolic images may lead audiences to believe that they have little responsibility in environmental issues. A researcher named Monica Dejerf-Pierre published a journal in 2012 titled When Attention Drives Attention: Issue Dynamics in Environmental News Reporting Over 5 Decades. This study questions This study asks questions that seek to understand how media coverage of one environmental issue impacts the public attendance to others. This research explains consequences of the influence that news media has on public perceptions on environmental issues and organizations. Researchers named Fuwan Shen, Lee Ahern, and Michelle Baker published a journal in 2014 titled Stories That Count: Influence of News Narratives on Issue Attitudes. The study asks one research question, and I quote, "Do empathy, transportation, and cognitive responses mediate the relationship between news narrative and issue attitude?" This research shows that by reporting environmental issues as narrative news or informational news will impact and influence the public's perception on environmental issues and organizations. A researcher named Irene Polach published a journal in 2013 titled Corporate Environmental Reporting and News Coverage of Environmental Issues: An Agenda-Setting Perspective. The study asks questions that seek to understand how news media and corporate agendas are set. This research shows that by reporting environmental issues as narrative news or informational news will impact and influence the public's perception on environmental issues and organizations. A researcher named Kyun So Kim published a journal in 2010 titled Public Understanding of the Politics of Global Warming in the News Media: The Hostile Media Approach. The author poses one research question. I quote, "Does anger mediate the relationship between partisanship and perceived media bias?" Kim, 2011. The research relates to my topic because the way the news media reports issues not related to environment diminishes their credibility when they report on environmental issues, specifically global warming. Researchers named Jacques Van Dienebel and Danny Wildemarsh published a journal in 2010 titled How Farmers Learn About Environmental Issues: Reflections on a Sociobiographical Approach. This journal does not pose any questions, but instead provides a hypothesis and uses results and findings from their research to support their claim. This research shows that news media influences the public's perception of environmental issues in a way that decreases cooperation and participation among farmers in implementing new sustainable technologies and practices. Researchers named Fuhai Hong and Zhao Zhao published a journal in 2014 titled Information Manipulation and Climate Agreements. The journal proposes research questions that seek to gain an understanding in why politicians and mainstream media manipulate the reports on climate change. The research relates to my topic because it shows that news media, by and large, does not provide comprehensive reports on the environmental issues they choose to cover. I conclude that more research and discussion is needed in order to develop and create a platform for which news media and environmental organizations can engage in collaborative, transparent decision-making processes and discuss technologies and strategies for a sustainable future while delivering informative news to the public. Thank you for your time.